In the middle of a live congressional hearing, a white former attorney general looked Jasmine Crockett straight in the eye and told her to go back to Africa. What Jasmine did next wasn't loud, but it was deadly. She didn't argue. She opened a Justice Department file that exposed years of racial discrimination under Bondi's leadership, harsher sentencing for black defendants, political pressure to crack down on minority groups to gain voter approval. So the question is, what happens when the truth walks into power and refuses to back down? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Washington, D.C., Wednesday morning. The air outside was dry and sharp like a blade. Inside the Capitol, hearing room 4A was packed wall to wall. Every seat reserved for the public had been filled since sunrise. Cameras lined the back of the room, network crews, press reporters, independent streamers, all pointed at two microphones in the center of the hearing floor. This wasn't just any congressional session. It was a hearing on racial bias in America's criminal justice system. People hadn't come to listen. They came to witness, to find out if justice in this country truly wore a blindfold or just turned its face away from certain skin tones. On the left side of the table sat Jasmine Crockett, a black congresswoman from Texas, former criminal defense attorney with over 100 courtroom victories. She wore a navy blue suit, sat upright like a steel rod, and held the gaze of the room like a conductor leading a symphony. Jasmine didn't come to perform, she came to prosecute. She was the embodiment of a new wave in America, young, brilliant, and unafraid to confront the R-Rod in the system, not just with passion but with proof. Across from her sat Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida. Blonde, composed, exuding the chill of courtroom confidence. Her career had been built on tough-on-crime policies, praised by conservatives, criticized by civil rights groups for racial disparities in prosecutions. Today, she wasn't behind a podium of power. She was answering, or at least expected to, but this wasn't just a meeting between two public officials. It was a collision between two American realities. On one side, reform, accountability, the demand for equity. On the other, tradition, order, and the fear that change could unravel a nation too proud to admit its flaws. Two women, two skin tones, two visions of America, and one burning question hanging in the air. Does justice in America see color? The room had settled. The cameras were locked in place, red lights blinking steadily like waiting eyes. Pages stopped rustling. Phones were on silent. Reporters held pens just above their notepads, waiting not just to transcribe, but to capture a moment. This was that kind of morning, the kind history books footnote, the kind you never forget. A senior clerk stood and called the hearing to order. The Committee on Justice and Civil Rights is now in session. Chairs shifted, suits straightened. The chairman, a gray-haired man from Oregon with a voice like sandpaper, offered brief remarks, then nodded toward Jasmine Crockett. She cleared her throat once, not out of nervousness, but focus. Her eyes didn't search the room. They locked onto it, unyielding. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Today I stand not as an adversary, but as a witness to a pattern we've all seen and too few have named. I hope we can examine not just statutes she never got to finish. Pam Bondi leaned forward, voice smooth, surgical, and unmistakably loaded with contempt. Maybe, she said, instead of trying to teach America how to do justice, you should go back to Africa and study your own roots first. The silence was instant and chilling, not shocking silence, strategic, calculated, terrifying. A heartbeat passed, then another. A young black aide turned his head. A woman in the gallery gasped, hand frozen halfway to her coffee cup. Someone whispered a curse under their breath. And then nothing. Just the weight of those words, hovering in the space between microphones and marble columns, suffocating any pretense of decorum. Jasmine did not flinch. She didn't recoil. She didn't raise her voice. She remained perfectly still, the kind of stillness that signals not confusion, but control. Her hands rested gently on the table, her posture composed, untouched by the chaos beginning to stir around her. Only her eyes moved. They lifted slowly and settled on Pam Bondi, calm and precise. There was no fire in them, but something far more exact. Focus. The expression on her face did not accuse. It was examined. Across the chamber, staffers shifted in their seats. A reporter paused mid-sentence, pen hovering above paper. The weight in the room had turned, no longer centered on the insult, but on the response that was about to follow. Then came Jasmine's voice, measured, cool, and devastating in its simplicity. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "What did you just say?" It wasn't a request. It was a reckoning. The question didn't fill the space. It emptied it, forcing everyone to confront the ugliness now hanging in the air. No longer deniable, no echo, no murmuring. Only the tense awareness of a room that had shifted from legal procedure to moral theater. Jasmine remained motionless, but her presence had expanded. There was nothing defensive in her tone, only precision, clarity, and beneath it, the suggestion that something much larger than a reply was coming. Pam Bondi rose from her chair with a slow, almost ceremonial calm. The kind of calm that doesn't soften a blow but sharpens it. She didn't fumble. She didn't raise her voice. Her movements were controlled, rehearsed, like someone who had already decided she wasn't going to back down. Her eyes moved across the room, past the cameras, past the aides and representatives, and locked on to Jasmine. Her hands smoothed the hem of her blazer, a subtle gesture that looked like composure but felt like tightening armor. Then she leaned slightly forward, adjusted the mic, and spoke, with the clarity of someone who wanted her words to carry, not just through the chamber, but through every living room in America. "I said, if you think this country is so unjust, so broken, then maybe you should go back to Africa and fix that instead." The sentence didn't echo, not because it wasn't loud, but because it hit too fast, too hard, too directly. For a moment, it felt like the air itself paused, not silence from quiet, silence from tension, like everyone had been forced to hold their breath at the same time. A senator near the back shifted, uncomfortably but didn't speak. A congressional aide dropped her pen and didn't bother picking it up. The camera crew didn't move, but one of them instinctively zoomed in, tighter, like trying to frame the shame more clearly. Across the country, millions of TVs were now replaying. The sentence, raw, uncensored on every news channel, captions already scrolling. The words didn't just insult, they revealed. They cracked something open that had always been there, beneath the suits, behind the language of policy and civility. And in this moment, it wasn't about debate, it wasn't even about politics. It was about what had just been said, and the fact that it had been said into a live microphone on government record. No one could pretend they hadn't heard it. Pam had thrown her words like a weapon, but the moment they hit the air, they no longer belonged to her. The silence that followed belonged to Jasmine, and everyone knew it. Jasmine didn't flinch, she didn't throw her hands up, she didn't demand silence, she didn't shout. What she did instead was worse for those hoping she'd crumble. She stayed still for a long moment, breathing calm, eyes lowered just slightly, like sorting through not just what to say but how to say it. Then she stood. The legs of her chair scraped quietly, but loud enough in the silence to turn heads. She didn't rush, didn't perform, she just pushed her chair back and stepped away from the table. Her heels clicked gently on the marble. She walked forward, not toward Pam, but toward the center of the room. The space between the rows felt like a stage, but she wasn't performing, she was claiming ground. And by the time she reached the middle, every pair of eyes, from aides to senators to cameramen, were locked on her. She stood tall, hands at her sides, face steady. She didn't need to raise her voice. The room was already hers. When she began to speak, her voice was soft, but it traveled clear, full, without a tremor. "I was born in Texas," she said, pausing briefly before the next line. "My father served in the United States military. He wore the uniform, followed orders, risked his life for this country. My mother was a nurse, a caregiver, who never asked what her patients believed or what color they were. She just helped. That's what we were raised to do, to serve, to work hard, to believe in a place that has not always believed in us." She took a breath, and the room shifted. Some dropped their gaze. Others watched closer, now leaning in. "But my story doesn't start with them," she continued. "It starts with the people who never got to tell theirs. My ancestors didn't book a flight here. They didn't come chasing the American dream. They were chained, shackled, torn from their homes, dragged across the Atlantic like cargo, packed into ships so tight they couldn't even stand. They were sold, branded, forced into labor on stolen land, and for generations they were told they didn't count, not as citizens, not even as humans. But they survived. They endured." There was no anger in her voice, just truth, heavy, grounded, real. "And somehow," she said, "after everything, they still believed in something better. They fought, they built, they gave birth to people like me, people who still believe in this country, even when it forgets us." She turned her gaze now, directly, openly toward Pam Bondi. Her tone didn't change, but her eyes did. They sharpened, not with hate, not with rage, but with clarity. Cold, clear clarity. "You want me to go back to Africa?" Her voice steady as stone. "Let me tell you something. I was here before you were born. My family's blood was in this soil before your family ever signed a mortgage. We were here before your laws let us vote, before your schools let us learn, before your sidewalks had our names carved into history." Her voice didn't rise, but its weight grew heavier with every word. "You look at me and see someone who doesn't belong, but I'm not the guest here, I'm the foundation. You don't get to ask me to leave a house that was built on the backs of my ancestors. You don't get to erase the pain, the work, the dignity that came long before you could even stand in this room." There were no gasps now, only silence. Dense, loaded, listening. Jasmine's voice dropped even lower. "You say I should leave, that I should go back? My people died here. They gave birth here. They were buried, without names, without gravestones, without justice. But they stayed, and I'm still here." She paused, not for applause, not for effect, but because the weight needed room to settle. She looked around the room, not seeking approval, just making sure there was no escape from what had just been said. "So no," she said softly but unshakably, "I'm not going back, I'm not leaving, I belong here, and I'm not the one who needs to be reminded of that." Jasmine had just claimed her history, but now she turned to the thing power fears most. Proof. Jasmine didn't turn up the volume. She didn't change her tone, but something shifted. Her stance steadied, her shoulders squared, her hands still, her voice now a touch firmer, like someone moving from memory into evidence. She returned to her seat, only long enough to reach down, into a plain black leather folder resting under her desk. The moment her hand pulled out the document, the energy in the room changed. It was thick, heavy, a pale gray cover with a red diagonal stamp across the front. Confidential DOJ, Florida 2018. A few heads turned, others froze. She didn't wave it, didn't raise it high. She simply walked it to the center, held it at waist, height, and looked straight at Pam Bondi. No anger, no smile, just a cold, steady focus that said everything without saying anything extra. She lifted the file slightly, just enough for everyone on the panel to see the stamp. Then her voice returned, low. "Director, surgical." "Mrs. Bondi," she said, "I assume this looks familiar to you. This report was submitted to the U.S. Department of Justice in 2018 during your final year in office as Attorney General of Florida. There was no response and none was needed. The silence was heavier now, not just tense, expectant. Jasmine opened the folder, slowly. Inside, pages dog-eared, highlighted, annotated. She knew it inside out. She had read it more times than she wanted to admit. She flipped to the first marked tab, thumb pressing down firm. The paper rustled. That was the only sound in the room. She didn't read right away. She let the sight of the report sit in the air, breathing. Then she looked up again, not to the crowd, not to the cameras, but straight into the face of the woman who had told her to go back to Africa. "This document," she said clearly, "is not an opinion. It is not hearsay. It is not something I wrote. It is a federal analysis submitted under your administration, investigating patterns of racial bias in the criminal prosecution system of your state." She stood, file open in her hands. The weight of it, suddenly heavier than it looked. Her voice didn't rise, but the tension in the room did. Each page she turned deep in the silence. Every movement was slow, intentional, like someone disarming a bomb. In public, no panic, no drama, just cold, methodical truth. She found the first tab. Her thumb brushed a chart, taking up half the page. Yellow highlights glaring beneath the lights, bold, impossible to ignore. She didn't look around for applause. She looked down, and she read. According to this internal analysis from the Florida Department of Justice, black defendants were recommended sentences that were, on average, 32% longer than white defendants for the same exact charges. She looked up, not dramatically, just directly as if asking, "Can anyone explain that number for me?" No one did. She continued. Same charge, same courtroom, same judge sometimes. But one person walks out with probation and another with years. She flipped to the next tab. A small red note stuck out like a wound. Her eyes scanned the paragraph. Only a second. Then she read it aloud. Prosecutors showed a documented pattern, that's the language here, of upgrading charges when the defendant's surname appeared to be African or Hispanic in origin. That means the only thing changing was the name. Not the evidence, not the facts. Just the name. Her voice didn't shake, but it slowed. It had to, because these weren't just stats, these were lives. Your last name could be Martinez or Abdul or King, and that alone might mean the difference between community service and prison. The report doesn't speculate on intent. It doesn't need to. The numbers speak loud enough. She turned another page. Slower this time, the kind of slow that makes people hold their breath. Page 47, she said softly. Analysis of wrongful arrests across the state. 87% of them happened in predominantly black or Latino neighborhoods. 87%. She paused. Let that sit. Then continue. Of those cases, less than 5% resulted in any formal apology. None. 0 resulted in financial restitution. People were arrested, taken from their homes, humiliated, sometimes held for days, and then just released. No explanation, no accountability, no justice. The statistics were damning, the patterns undeniable. But what came next? It was what silenced even the most stubborn defender, a sentence written by one of their own. The pages no longer shook in Jasmine's hands. Her voice, calm, almost slow, like a judge handing down a sentence after a trial too long, ignored. She didn't raise her tone, didn't dramatize the moment. She just read, slowly, clearly. "And here," she said, flipping gently to a tabbed page near the back. Her thumb paused on a paragraph, highlighted in pale orange. "Is a direct quote from a memo written by your own senior legal advisor." There was no build-up, no setup. She looked at the page, then she looked up. and with the same unshaken tone she read the sentence aloud, word for word, like a blade slicing through air. There is pressure from upper leadership to crack down harder on minority suspects, especially in election years, in order to maintain support from the base. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They hung there, thick, heavy, like fog. No one could now pretend it wasn't real. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was suffocating. No one shuffled papers, no one whispered strategy. Even the cameras seemed to slow, as if afraid of blinking. Somewhere in the back row, someone whispered, barely audible, "Jesus Christ." When she actually found it, a staffer gasped. Not loud, but enough for her colleague to stiffen. A senator muttered something, rubbed his face. No one looked at Pam Bondi. Not yet. All eyes were on Jasmine, who stood like a stone, steady, unshaken. Then she slowly closed the folder. The motion. Gentle. Not a slam. Not a flourish. Just final. Her hands rested on top of the file. As she raised her head, her gaze fixed on the woman who had, moments ago, told her to go back to where she came from. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't smile. She simply spoke. Voice steady, eyes locked, as if addressing a courtroom that had been in denial for far too long. "You told me I should go back to Africa?" Her tone stripped of all emotion, except truth. "Maybe you should go back and read the documents from the country you helped run." Her words didn't come like bullets. They came like bricks, stacked into a wall of reality no one could climb over. Justice doesn't come from slogans or speeches or spin. It doesn't come from being loud or from talking first. It comes from courage and from facing the truth, even when it's ugly, even when it's yours. There was still no response from Bondi, none expected. Her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale, her expression somewhere between disbelief and collapse. She didn't reach for the mic, she didn't interrupt. Because at that moment, there was nothing left to say that could undo what had been said. And worse, what had been proven. Jasmine took one step back, not for effect, not for the cameras, just to let the air move again. But her presence didn't shrink. If anything, it expanded. Because now the silence belonged to her. It was no longer the awkward hush that followed insult. It was the heavy quiet that comes when someone delivers truth so clearly, so plainly that there is no room left to argue. "You talk about law and order," she said, her voice lowering now, quieter but still razor-sharp. "But all I see here is selective justice, manufactured fear, and a system built not to protect everyone, but to preserve power for the few." She paused, scanning the room. Now, eyes were meeting hers. Not all of them, not loudly, but enough. Enough to see that the ground had shifted. Even here, in this building where denial wears suits and calls itself policy, the silence had turned. Across the aisle, a Democratic senator nodded once, slowly. Opposite him, a Republican committee member, older, gray, rarely known to break party lines, gave a small, almost imperceptible tilt of the head. No applause, no grand gestures, just acknowledgement. The kind that comes when even political armor can't defend the indefensible. Jasmine let out a slow breath, not in relief but in control. Everything she had brought, the testimony, the memory, the document, the truth, had now been spoken aloud, in full, in front of the nation. She didn't need to win anyone over. She just needed them to hear it, to know, and they did. The hearing ended, but the moment didn't, because some truths once spoken don't stay in the room. They move, they spread, and they don't ask for permission. By the time Jasmine stepped away from the podium and returned to her seat, the video was already being clipped. A congressional aide with a phone held low had caught it. So had a reporter. In the back, live streaming the hearing to 20,000 silent viewers. And then it was out 10 seconds, 20 seconds, a full minute. Edited versions hit TikTok first, then Twitter, then YouTube. Some added no captions, no edits, no filters, just raw footage. Jasmine Crockett, standing in the middle of the United States Capitol, folder in hand, looking a former Attorney General dead in the eye and saying, "You want me to go back to Africa? Read The Country You Ran." It spread like fire, not because it was loud, but because it was real. Real in a way that broke through politics, through partisanship, through the numbness of another news cycle. It wasn't a debate. It wasn't a scandal. It was a moment, and it hit differently. The clip was viewed 3 million times in the first 6 hours, 10 million by the end of the day. It was trending on X, stitched across thousands of TikTok, played on a loop on political podcasts, late-night talk shows, and Instagram reels. But it wasn't just the volume that made it matter. It was who was sharing it and why. A retired U.S. Marine posted the video with one line. "This wasn't an argument. This was a bullet through every lie I was taught to believe about justice." A university professor tweeted a transcript with the caption, "Teaching this in class tomorrow. No notes. This is what courage looks like." And then there was the father. A white man in his early 40s, sitting in a small living room somewhere in Pennsylvania, posted a video of himself watching Jasmine's speech with his son. The boy was maybe 12, eyes wide, hands still. The father didn't say anything while the clip played. But when it ended, the boy looked at him and said, "She sounds like Grandpa when he talks about the war." The man choked up, turned to the camera and said, "I watched this with my son, and I'm proud that he cried." The comment section blew up. Thousands responded. Veterans, teachers, nurses, construction workers, stay-at-home moms, teenagers, retirees, black, white, brown, people who'd never agreed on anything before. Suddenly sharing something more powerful than politics. The shock of hearing someone finally tell the truth without flinching. Some said it reminded them of their own silences, their own fears, the times they'd wanted to speak up and hadn't. One comment read, "I didn't realize how much I needed to hear someone say it. Like that, calm, director, unapologetic." Another said, "This wasn't about race alone, this was about dignity, and it reminded me how far we still have to go." In barbershops in Atlanta, it was playing on TV. In classrooms in Detroit, it was discussed by students who'd never watched a congressional hearing in their lives. In diners in Oklahoma and gas stations in Ohio, people watched it over coffee, some nodding quietly, some shaking their heads. But watching, really watching. And on cable news, the debate was no longer about whether the system was biased. It was about whether this hearing had just changed the conversation for good. Analysts scrambled for statements. Pam Bondi declined to appear. Her office released one line. "No comment at this time." It didn't help. The silence only confirmed what Jasmine's voice had already made plain. Even lawmakers, usually cautious, couldn't avoid the wave. Some tweeted support outright, others stayed quiet. But their silence stood in stark contrast to the sound of the nation speaking for itself. The hearing was no longer just on record. It was on replay, in phones, in inboxes, in minds. It wasn't going away. In interviews, Jasmine said little. She didn't do a media tour. She didn't sell the moment. When asked what she felt when the clip went viral, she said, "I didn't say it for the cameras. I said it because someone had to, and that's why it hit harder than most headlines ever could. Because it wasn't designed for sound bites. It was a truth. Bomb dropped in a room built to contain polite lies, and it exploded. The cameras had stopped rolling. The country had moved on, or so it seemed, but not everyone left the room untouched. And some truths don't erupt. They erode, one quiet hour at a time. Pam Bondi sat alone. Not just physically, though that too was true. Her staff had scattered. The aides, who usually hovered with notebooks and water bottles, were nowhere in sight. No reporters chased her for quotes. No senators offered a handshake. Not even a single one. "We'll talk later." Just silence. Thick, dense and unfamiliar. She sat at the edge of a cold marble bench in a back corridor of the Capitol, far from the bright lights and bold voices. The hearing room was empty now, its chairs pushed back and under.